The darkest moments of the human psyche have birthed the most terrifying of figures. Though their sprees have long ceased, their malevolent presence still lingers today. No one knew it at the time, but beginning in 1903, something incredibly sinister was underway in Germany. As far as anyone was concerned, the town was safe from homicidal entities and frenzied maniacs. Despite the ongoing social tensions at the time, people believed they were not in harm's way. In fact, they felt so safe that some generous individuals would allow destitute individuals to live in their homes. One such charitable person was Karl Denke, a much-liked member of his community. Denke was born in a little-known village in Lower Silesia in 1870. Not much is known about his life aside from the allegation that he was a terrible student and supposedly ran away from home at a young age. When he was 25 years old, his father passed away, and even though he lost contact with his family, he still inherited a substantial amount of money. He used the inheritance to buy a property with a house, a shed, and a garden in Münsterberg. But Denke had an incredibly dark secret that nobody would have guessed if it weren't for one particular event that would unravel his second sinister life. It was the 21st of December, 1924, when a homeless man appeared at the police station. He was drenched in his own vital fluid and began making an unexpected claim. He alleged that he'd just escaped from Denke's apartment with his life. Of course, the police were slow to respond to this accusation, given that he was a beggar and because the accused was an upstanding citizen. But following a medical determination that the man had indeed been attacked, specifically with an axe that left a severe head wound behind, the police decided to pay Denke a visit. He was questioned and admitted to having attacked the victim, claiming that he had tried to rob him. Though the police were receptive to the explanation, they took the suspect down to the holding cell, where he would remain as the matter was being resolved. Before any further investigation could take place, though, the suspect would meet his untimely demise right there in his cell. Despite the event, though, the police were still reluctant to believe that Denke would do anything wrong. It wouldn't be until Christmas Eve, when they headed to his apartment to secure his belongings, that they would finally discover what kind of monster had been living among them. In the house, a makeshift meat processing station was found, but lab tests revealed that the meat didn't belong to animals. Hundreds of bones littered the apartment, 240 teeth, dehydrated skins, and a closet full of red-stained clothes. It turned out that since 1903, Denke had been preying upon the homeless who had left their lives to live in his home. As the authorities continued to search the apartment in disbelief, more and more disturbing things would become apparent. Some of the human remains had actually been made into items, such as belts or shoes. Through the documents and identification papers that Denke left behind, investigators were able to positively identify at least 20 of his victims, most of whom had been released from hospitals or prison before they came into his care. When taking into account all the evidence discovered in the apartment, authorities were forced to accept the obvious and realized that this upstanding citizen had been secretly responsible for more than 40 homicides. The harrowing crimes quickly made their way into the public eye, sending shockwaves through the community. It was Dean Corll, who would become known as the Candyman, who left behind brutal scenes across Houston and Pasadena, which would be viewed as a mass homicide by the time he finally stopped. The Candyman moniker was given to this serial slayer for his affiliation with the Houston Heights Candy Factory. He was also known to give out free candy to the local children, a disturbing habit given the later revelations. His spree began in 1970 and lasted for 3 years. During that time, he racked up a minimum of 29 victims, the only ones who were able to be confirmed. It's believed, though, that this disturbed individual was responsible for many more, most of whom were at the very start of adulthood. His charming demeanor and his kindness towards children made him a trusted figure in the community, making his method of slaughter all the easier. Corll would lure his victims in by offering them a ride to one of his several addresses, with promises of a party. But those parties would be less balloons, flickering lights, and music, and instead be abduction, torture, and homicide by asphyxiation or other fatal wounds. Unlike most serial slayers, the Candyman didn't operate alone, and was instead assisted by two young men, David Brooks and Elmer Henley. Many of the victims were allegedly friends with either one or both of the accomplices, making it even easier to prey on them. Once the victims were at the desired home, narcotics and alcohol would dominate the evening. Everyone seemingly ignoring the marine-grade plywood torture board hanging on the wall. Following several days of torture and eventual demise, the victims were placed inside a boat storage shed in the greater Houston area, partially hidden within the trees. They would only be found much later, in the last stages of decomposition. Coral was stealthy and well organized, even though he didn't really have to be. His persuasive techniques, alleged charm, and young accomplices were what really moved his spree along. Aiding in the mass slaughter even further was the fact that the police were completely unaware that anything sinister was going on. There was no suspicion of a kidnapper, nor a homicidal maniac being on the loose in Houston. Coral was never apprehended, convicted, nor did he serve any prison time for his psychopathic onslaught. But that's because he never got the chance to, and his wrongdoings were only exposed after his demise. In 1973, it seemed that Coral had gotten too comfortable with evading suspicion, and he lured 20-year-old Timothy Curley to his home. The usual events would follow: narcotics, drinking, and blacking out. But this time, something had gone awry. Another individual had come to the home, inviting his accomplice, Henley. Angered, Coral would wait for the accomplice to black out before binding him. Henley, though, woke up and devised a brilliant plan. As Coral pressed a weapon to his head, he began to convince him that he would help him torture the other captives, including the uninvited guest. As the night unfolded thereafter, Coral left his .22 firearm on the nightstand as the torture began. Seeing the opportunity, enraged by what was happening, Henley grabbed it and fired upon the Candyman, ending his life quickly and forcefully. The next morning, the police were called, and the last 3 years were recounted in vivid detail, uncovering one of the worst criminal sprees known to man. Subsequently, a hunt for the victims ensued, with 29 of them being found with evidence of serious torture. Some of them are still awaiting identification. Though many may view the fear of doctors as irrational, logic can be found in the disturbing stories of healthcare professionals gone bad. If the occurrences of the past have taught us anything, it would be not to trust anybody. History is marred by unstable practitioners who caused intentional harm to their patients, namely Dr. William Palmer, known as the Prince of Poisoners, Dr. H.H. Holmes, who used gas to suffocate his victims, Dr. Joseph Swango, who continued his spree even after he was imprisoned for it, Dr. Joseph Mengele, the most evil, corrupt physician of all time, and finally Dr. Harold Shipman, one of Britain's most notorious serial slayers. The name Harold Shipman is one that evokes a spine shiver among the true crime community. He was born in 1946 in Nottingham, England, and to the outside world he appeared to be any other ordinary child. But to those closest to him, a personality of inflated ideas of superiority emerged. Shipman also exhibited an obsession with dominating others. His mother, Vera, was a powerful influence on his life, and her passing seemed to have sparked a turning point for this warped individual's psychology. Though he was still a young man, in his teenage years, when Vera passed, Shipman would learn a specific technique of extermination from watching the suffering. He had seen how morphine could alleviate suffering, and how it could terminate the sufferer. This would be his initiation into the use of controlled substances as a technique in homicide. When he became an adult, Shipman studied at a university where his performance was so high that he ultimately gained admission to Leeds University, where he could study medicine. In 1972, he graduated, a terrible mistake that wouldn't be realized until much later. Following this, he would establish a medical practice, with his bosses and coworkers allegedly ignoring signs of poor behavior that were supposedly prevalent at the very beginning. In 1974, Shipman was named a member of the Todmorden Group practice located in West Yorkshire. Here, his alleged painkiller addiction was exposed, and he was enrolled in a rehab program. Instead of his career being terminated, though, he was permitted to continue practicing. In 1977, he would find work as a general practitioner in Hyde. where he would go on to commit the majority of his homicides. Viewed as a good doctor, Shipman was happy to make house calls to check up on his elderly patients, and was often described as a friendly individual by family members. Behind the facade, though, lingered a monster. The doctor was targeting these older patients, his modus operandi never faltering. He would go to their homes for mild ailments, but would instead inject his patients with a fatal dose of diamorphine, a medication that's excreted quickly and wouldn't show up in postmortems unless it was intentionally tested for. Shipman would then alter the medical notes to state that the patients were gravely ill. He also encouraged families to opt for cremation, with the hopes of incinerating any and all evidence of his crimes. For the next 21 years, the onslaught would continue, unbeknownst to anyone. It wouldn't be until 1998 that an 81-year-old woman was found deceased in her home just hours after Shipman visited her. The family was confounded by the sudden demise, suggesting that she had been in good health. They were also shocked to find that the woman's will had been changed to benefit the doctor, bequeathing her entire estate to him. Shipman's insistence that an autopsy was unnecessary was also viewed as highly suspicious. But in 2002, he would be convicted of 15 counts of homicide, 1 count of forgery, and subsequently sentenced to life in prison. The Rostov Ripper, Andrei Chikatilo, the Butcher of Rostov, the Red Ripper. He was known by many names as he haunted the Soviet era, claiming lives wherever he went. Born in 1936 in a village located in the heart of rural Ukraine, Chikatilo, along with the rest of the USSR, was suffering from widespread hardships and famine that began to decimate the population due to Stalin's agricultural collectivization policy. Adding to the external hardships, Chikatilo was also suffering from water on the brain, a condition known as hydrocephalus. This would cause him unfortunate issues later in life. Only further adding to his problematic life was his father's capture during the war against Germany. Allegedly, he was held prisoner and ultimately vilified by his own men for allowing himself to be captured. He was viewed as a coward. Due to this, Chikatilo would become the main target at school for bullying, leading him to become withdrawn and shy. When he became an adult, he failed the entrance exam to Moscow State University and would instead become part of the national service. Chikatilo lived near Rostov in the 60s, where he would connect with a woman named Fayena, whom he would marry and have 2 children with. In 1971, for unknown reasons, the man felt the need for a career change, and he ultimately became a school teacher. Then, the slayings would begin. The attacks were launched upon females that he could easily overpower, which would often end in Chikatilo taking a sharpened blade to his victims. The man had been spotted by eyewitnesses with one of his first victims, who disappeared shortly after, but Fayena would offer an ironclad alibi for him, which enabled him to continue what would become a spree of slaughter. Bizarrely, another man named Alexander would be arrested and confess to the crimes under duress, the result of a brutal interrogation. With claims of abuse still lingering around Chikatilo, he began finding issues maintaining a teaching post, and eventually became a clerk at a factory in Rostov, where he had direct access to a range of victims for the next 9 years. Starting in 1981, the Red Ripper began targeting both males and females, most of whom were runaways. He would befriend them at train stations or bus stops and lure them into the connecting forests. Chikatilo would attack once they were alone, using a sharpened blade to mutilate his victims. In most cases, he would remove body parts such as the tips of the victims' tongues or their noses. His main focus, though, would be their eyes, believing that the imprint of his face remained in them even after their departure from this life. This modus operandi allowed several homicidal cases to be linked to one man, but the idea of a serial slaying was being suppressed by the state-controlled media to maintain public order. In 1983, though, things were going to change. Major Mikhail Fetisov knew that something horrible was going on here, and he began to investigate. His work centered mainly on the mentally ill, but the confessions of the interrogated suspects were deemed untrustworthy. Each crime, though, was producing more and more forensic evidence, giving the authorities a new angle. The maniac was believed to be blood type AB, suggested by the DNA, and he was known to have gray hair, which was retrieved from several scenes. As the search was underway for someone matching that description, Chikatilo was arrested for suspicious behavior. His bodily fluid type was tested against the evidence they had, and it was a match. But he escaped the suspicion of homicide, and his spree was on again. For the next few years, the bodies continued to rack up, and detectives were left scratching their heads. But eventually, in 1990, Chikatilo was arrested again, and refused to admit his involvement at first. But ultimately, he opened up to a psychiatrist and exposed the details of the slayings and even led the police to the sites of several bodies. He totaled at 56, but there were possibly more victims by the end of his spree. It was the 28th of June, 1993, when two troopers decided to stop a suspicious 1984 tan Mazda B2000 pickup. The truck was driving on the Southern State Parkway with no license plate affixed. As soon as the driver realized what was happening, he sped up, hoping to evade the troopers. He exited at Wantagh Avenue, heading northbound at 65 miles per hour. The officers were in pursuit and notified communications that they were in need of assistance. The Mazda only picked up speed, now traveling at 90 miles per hour, with several officers from Nassau County and the Garden City Police Department now joining in. For 25 minutes, the chase ensued, until finally the Mazda came to a rest on the sidewalk. The driver was Joel David Rifkin, and he was immediately arrested. Initially apprehended for reckless endangerment, the case would soon become a full-blown homicide investigation when officers uncovered the body of a deceased woman, Tiffany Braciani, who was hidden in the rear of the vehicle. The investigation into Rifkin that followed would reveal a treacherous past, red-stained and marred by violence. Rifkin was born in 1959 to two college students who were unwed. In his teens, he desperately tried to fit in with the rest of his peers by joining the track team, but he still faced ridicule and torment. He even faced the same struggles when he joined the yearbook staff. It appeared that the mistreatment and isolation that he faced may have weighed heavily on Rifkin, who now retreated into his own dark and disturbed world that saw him fantasizing about slaughtering women. By 1972, he would become fixated on one particular type of victim, ladies of the night. Erroneously, his adoptive parents gave him a car, the very one that would be used to troll for his victims in Hempstead and Manhattan. His passion and obsession would only worsen when he entered Nassau Community College. He skipped class often and hardly showed up for his part-time jobs. He instead spent his time with street workers. By 1989, he could no longer fight his violent, psychopathic fantasies. Rifkin waited for his parents to leave before bringing one of the women home to Long Island. Susie thought it was just another business exchange, but instead she would be bludgeoned. When she continued to fight against the assailant, he would asphyxiate her and used an X-Acto blade to remove her fingertips to prevent identification. Her decollated head was hidden in a paint can, while the rest of her remains were discarded in the woods in both New Jersey and New York. This would be the first of several more slayings that used a similar modus operandi. He would go on to stifle 17 women, and identifying them would prove difficult each time. From 1989 to 1993, he ripped his way through New York, claiming lives and acting on his insane fantasies. Rifkin's capture that year revealed a massacre, allowing police to finally put names to the Jane Does they'd found scattered across the state. Rifkin received his first life sentence in the case of Tiffany in 1994, and in 1995 he received 2 more life sentences, then 3 more by 96, and he racked up a total of 8 life sentences, which he continues to serve today at the age of 66. Hollywood was a threatening place to be for a young, upcoming actress in the late 50s. Starting in 1957 and lasting for a year, Hollywood was beset by a series of some incredibly treacherous homicides, all committed by one man, the glamour girl slayer. The method was very much the same for each of the victims. The assailant would send out ads, suggesting that he was a photographer and was looking to hire models. Other times, he would circulate the idea that he was looking for a date. The unsuspecting women would meet up with the false photographer, who would pose for glamour shots before assaulting them and disposing of their bodies in the desert. The man behind the camera was a New York City-born man, Harvey Glattman. As far as most could tell, there was nothing that sent Glatman over the edge to begin the onslaught, aside from pre-existing psychiatric issues. As he spent most of his formative years in Denver, Colorado, his parents began to notice something peculiar about the young boy. He was displaying some disturbing behavior, identified as sadomasochistic. Unnerved by the behavior they'd witnessed, Glatman's parents took him to a professional who simply said he'd grow out of it, but that was far from the truth. By the time he was in middle school, he was already partaking in purse snatching, burglary, and most disturbingly, assaulting women. By the time he was in high school, Glatman would be beginning serving his time in prison, with several of his victims having identified him. During one of his stints, he would be diagnosed with psychopathic personality, schizophrenic type. It's unknown if he ever received treatment for this, but he was said to have been paroled in 1948, following one of his sentences. Then, in 1957, the glamour girl Slayer would move to Los Angeles, and treachery would subsequently grip the city. His first victim would be 19-year-old Judy Ann Dull. She was in an expensive custody battle with her estranged husband. When a photographer came around offering $50 for a model to pose over the cover of a pulp novel, she couldn't resist. On the day he arrived at her apartment, Dull's roommates saw no danger lurking around Glatman. He seemed gentlemanly and trustworthy. But as they slid behind closed doors, a harrowing event would unfold. After stifling her, he would take her body to a nearby deserted place. His next 3 victims would meet the same fate, all of whom were photographed, bound and gagged, and discarded in the desert. Glatman's 4th victim, though, would ultimately be his undoing. Lorraine Vigil saw her one and only opportunity to grab the muzzle of the firearm that Glatman was using to force his victims to do what he wanted. She managed to secure the firearm and pointed it at the glamour girl Slayer, keeping him there until police arrived. The authorities arrested him and subsequently uncovered a treasury of evidence, from photographs of his victims to souvenirs of the slayings. From 1986 to 2003, train users in Mexico, Canada, and the United States were not safe. The railroad slayer was on the loose, and he was using the railways to launch his unyielding attacks. By stowing away on trains, he would wait for the perfect opportunity to pounce. It didn't matter who the victim was. Ethnicity, gender, and age played no role in his choices. He was simply hungry for whatever slaying he could accomplish. After patiently lying in wait, the train users would fall victim to a sudden blow to the head, and before they even knew what was happening, they were gone. A few victims would be robbed and further assaulted, but this was often only a secondary intent. The main focus of the attacks was just the act of overpowering and slaughtering unsuspecting people. The man behind the mask was Angel Resendiz, whose childhood was nothing short of traumatic. He was born in 1960 and remained physically small well into adulthood. His mother allegedly never married his father and was said to have physically mistreated him. Eventually, he would be sent to live with his uncle, where things would only get worse. His uncle, too, mistreated him, and he was also assaulted by a local offender, all of which resulted in him running away. At a young age, Resendiz was living on the street and found himself entangled in the world of narcotics. In adulthood, he worked for a temp agency, but found himself spending 11 years in prison for auto theft, burglary, and firearm possession. It became clear that the hardships took a toll on the man, and eventually he snapped. From Mexico, he began traveling across the United States and Canada, crossing the borders illegally. By using several aliases, he was able to evade the authorities for a great amount of time, allowing his victims to rack up. By using the railways, Resendiz would seek out his victims, each of whom would be smaller than him and easy to overpower. His preferred weapon would be whatever was lying around at the time: pickaxes, rocks, or any other easy-to-wield blunt object. He would also use a blanket to cover the victim or any other method to obscure their vision and take himself out of immediate view. After each of the brutal homicides, Resendiz would linger around his victims' homes, usually to eat. He would then take several sentimental items belonging to them and lay out their driver's license, allegedly to learn more about them. The items he took would often be gifted to his wife, daughter, or his mother, who lived in Rodeo, Mexico. Though he stole several valuable and important items, Resendiz always left the cash behind. As the bodies across America continued to appear, with the same modus operandi present, investigators began to tie them all together. Through forensics, they were able to determine that each of the homicides was connected and was committed by the same perpetrator. In June of 1999, Resendiz was placed on the FBI's most wanted list with a reward of $50,000. That same month, law enforcement made contact with the railroad slayer's sister, promising that he would be given personal safety in prison, allowed regular visitations, and would be given psychological evaluations. That evaluation determined that Resendiz had paranoid schizophrenia and suffered from intense delusions. The sister was able to convince Resendiz to turn himself in, and on the 13th of July, he did just that. He was tried for homicide in the first degree, and the evidence was abundant, and was found guilty of 15 homicides. Jack Unterweger has a rather checkered past, marred by childhood abandonment and alcoholism. In his early teenage years, he turned to a life of crime, and at the young age of just 16, he saw himself arrested and jailed for assault. After prison, though, Unterweger showed signs of reform, having become a writer while he served time until 1990. He would go on to be revered by many of the notable Austrian intellectuals. By 1991, Unterweger would be hailed as a journalist, arriving in Los Angeles with assignments from Austrian media. This reformed criminal was going to be uncovering the city's darkness and insinuated himself in the Hollywood crowd, visiting the police department headquarters and even tagging along with the patrol officer. But at night, Unterweger's journalist facade would fall away, and he would become the very darkness that he was investigating. That summer, he headed downtown, picked up 3 ladies of the night, stifled them with his signature ligature, and then disposed of their bodies in the nearby woods, posing them in obscene positions. It was this very modus operandi that he'd actually learned of back at home in Austria, where 7 victims would meet the same sinister fate. Unterweger was incredibly intelligent and charismatic, and exhibited symptoms of the classic malignant narcissist. This allowed him to blend in easily into the crowd and manipulate anyone to convince them of his false innocence. With his nature, he was able to build quite a shield from Austrian justice officials, well-known criminal psychiatrists, authors, and several other high-up figures. Austrian authorities, though, still suggested Unterweger as a suspect in the serial slayings that plagued the area from 1990 to 1991, and this was prior to his departure to the United States. They found nothing to suggest that he was in any way connected, but with the lack of alternatives, he was the only option left. But once he had left for the US, they stopped keeping ties with him, with criminologists suggesting that serial slayers often operate close to home and don't leave such a trail across 2 continents. But this was exactly what Unterweger was doing, becoming the first global serial killer known to the world. Being as articulate and mesmerizing as he was, he continued the onslaught, believing he was a free man. In reality, he was a mix of Ted Bundy and Hannibal Lecter, which many believe should have made him the prime suspect. But given that this was taking place at the same time as other notable events that were happening, it's clear that the street worker slayings were just being overshadowed. In 1992, Unterweger's luck had finally run out. Allegedly tipped off by journalists about police closing in on him, he fled to Miami. He was quickly found, though, apprehended and sent back to Australia, where DNA extracted from a single strand of blonde hair found in his BMW belonging to a homicide victim served as the most convicting evidence. By the end of it, many of the convictions hinged on this very DNA and the slayer's signature ligature. As a young man, Eric Edgar Cook wanted nothing more than to fit in. He was shy, socially awkward, and allegedly ashamed of his appearance. Cook was born with a cleft lip and a generally nervous nature, making him the perfect target for school bullies. Even when his lip had been repaired, he was all too aware of the imperfection that had been left behind. Home wasn't much better either, and at night he would often take to the streets to escape the uncaring atmosphere. He and his 2 siblings were forced to endure the violent temper of their father. Being the oldest, Cook had to deal with most of it. Things didn't get much better in his teenage years. The rejection he faced culminated in a burning rage, which reached its peak when he was denied entry into the church choir, resulting in him burning it down. This would be the first crime he committed, and he soon became engaged in acts of breaking and entering and theft in the local area. He faced punishments for these crimes, of course, but this would never dissuade him from boasting about his criminal activities to his peers, hoping it would impress them. By the time he was a young adult, it appeared that Cook's life was now heading in the right direction. He joined the military, hoping for a fresh start and to be accepted into society. But just 3 months in, the rejection was back, and he was discharged due to his childhood convictions. Though he was unbalanced by this, he still managed to keep his cool, got married, and even had 7 children. Then one day, all that rejection and anger came flooding back, and just as when he was a child, Cook began walking the streets at night. But this time, it was for a different reason. He was in search of unsuspecting prey. While still living the ordinary family life, Cook went on a spree, committing merciless slayings with no set modus operandi. They were random and took on various forms from asphyxiation to gory impalements. Sometimes he would use a firearm, a different one each time. Perth, Australia was left shaken by the terror that befell them, all committed by one unknown maniac. The slayer's behavior and inconsistency made it incredibly difficult for police to catch up with him. Investigations and the manhunt for one single perpetrator eventually began. Police interviewed more than 30 males older than 12, and they were fingerprinted, along with test firings of 60,022 rifles, which were one of the firearms used in several of the slayings. Then, it finally happened. In August of 1963, a rifle was found hidden in a bush. Ballistics confirmed that it had been used on one of the victims. So the police placed a duplicate weapon in the bush, attached to a fishing line, and they waited. Weeks later, Cook came walking by and grabbed the concealed firearm. He was snared, and the flames of fear that waged across Perth for 4 years were finally doused. The so-called night caller was caught. Though he initially denied it, Cook ultimately confessed to everything. Aileen Wuornos and her brother Keith were abandoned by their parents and later adopted by a Troy, Michigan family, who later ended up being their biological grandparents. Their upbringing from then on appeared to be fairly normal, and they were raised alongside 2 other adoptees. The only other unfortunate incident would be a fire scarring Wuornos' face, after which an explosive temper would become apparent. From then on, the young girl found it difficult to make friends, only further adding to her distress. When Wuornos found out who her adoptive parents truly were, tension beset the household, and she would later claim that her grandfather was actually a rather controlling and physically violent, disturbed man. In school, she would earn the nickname Cigarette Pig after offering favors to her peers in exchange for cigarettes. Wuornos ran away from home often and eventually found herself in juvenile detention. Still at a young age, she would drop out of school and bounce between the Wuornos home, the juvenile detention center, abandoned cars, and even the woods. Things eventually began looking up for Wuornos, who, at the age of 20, settled down with a wealthy man named Louis Gratz Fell. But due to her violent and ungovernable temper, they divorced, and she began a life of crime, from disorderly conduct to armed robbery, and from theft to driving under the influence. Her criminal tendencies were becoming very apparent, and then they escalated. In 1989, it began. Wuornos started a slaying spree that would last a harrowing 12 months, totaling 7 victims by the end of it. Each of her victims was a man, aged between 40 and 65, who met an untimely demise at the hands of Wuornos, armed with a firearm. For 12 months, she fatally wounded these men near the highways in North and Central Florida. In order, her victims were 51-year-old Richard Chase Mallory, 47-year-old David Andrew Spears, 40-year-old Charles Edmund Carskadden, 65-year-old Peter Abraham Sims, 50-year-old Troy Eugene Burris, 56-year-old Charles Richard Humphreys, and finally, 61-year-old Walter Gino Antonio. Wuornos, though, didn't seem bothered by being caught and left handprints and other evidence behind at each of her crime scenes. Still, she managed to evade capture and conviction until 1991, when a witness had seen Wuornos leaving the vehicle of the missing missionary, Sims. During her trials, something bizarre would become evident. Wuornos would sometimes confess to slaying one of her victims, and at other times completely deny it. Nonetheless, she was found guilty and sentenced to execution by lethal injection. Anyone who's watched the movie The Wolf of Wall Street will be familiar with Jordan Belfort, the stockbroker on whose career the movie is based. It details the running of his firm, Stratton Oakmont, and the charges that were brought against him when it was discovered that he was involved in a massive defrauding scheme. In the real world, we get our first glimpse into Belfort's mindset when we look at his tertiary education. Following high school, he started studying biology at American University in hopes that he would start a career as a dentist. But during a lecture, when the dean of the Maryland School of Dentistry told his class that dentistry is not a path to take when looking for financial success, Belfort immediately dropped out and started working as a salesman. He excelled at his role and managed to sell about 5,000 pounds of meat per week. But before long, his business failed and filed for bankruptcy. He decided to try his hand at stockbroking and landed a job at L.F. Rothschild, but he was laid off due to Black Monday stock market crashes that occurred in 1987. At the age of 30, he created his company, Stratton Oakmont, Inc. He marketed the company as an over-the-counter brokerage firm, and before long he was linked to more than 30 companies' initial public offerings. From the outside, the company seemed legitimate, and by all accounts, Belfort's career was on track to success. But the reality of what was going on behind closed doors was very different from the image that he was projecting to the public and his investors. It was eventually discovered that Stratton Oakmont was involved in pump-and-dump securities fraud, which involved inflated owned stock prices that were made to look genuine through the provision of false statements. This allowed him to sell the stock at a higher price after obtaining it cheaply. Once these stocks were sold, the price would then suddenly drop dramatically, and the owners of those shares would immediately lose a lot of money. Belfort would have been well aware of it, but as is expected from a sociopath, he simply didn't care that other people were losing their hard-earned money, while he profited from their misery. He used the money that he made from this scheme to attend and host elaborate parties, purchase expensive items such as cars and clothes, and before long he became addicted to illegal substances. As the company grew, Belfort eventually employed more than 1,000 stockbrokers, and the company was dealing with over $1 billion worth of stock. But the company was constantly hounded by the law, especially the National Association of Securities Dealers. Nevertheless, Belfort continued his fraudulent activities and seemed largely unbothered by the fact that he was being constantly investigated, possibly because of his sociopathic nature, which would have made him feel superior to others, and hence he would likely have believed that he would have never been found out. In 1996, the company was shut down by the National Association of Securities Dealers, and Belfort was arrested. He pleaded guilty to fraud and received a sentence of 4 years in prison, but he was released after serving less than 2. He then became an informant for the FBI and provided testimony against many of his former colleagues. Caligula is often called the Mad Roman Emperor, thanks to his strange, erratic, and often cruel tendencies. But in modern times, as we learn more about psychology, it's believed he was likely a sociopath or even a psychopath. He will forever remain one of the most notorious emperors to ever rule over Rome. After his birth, he was named Gaius Julius Caesar, and from the very start of his life, he started learning about politics, since his father, Germanicus, was a general in the Roman military, and his mother, Agrippina, along with Germanicus, was a member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He spent much of his youth accompanying his father on military campaigns, and he proved to be very popular with the army's legionaries. They provided him with a miniature military outfit, including boots, which were called caligae, leading to his nickname of Caligula, which means little boot. He would, however, revert to his full name once he was crowned emperor. After traveling to Egypt in the year 10, his father contracted malaria and passed away, but Agrippina insisted that he'd been poisoned by the governor at the orders of Tiberius. He and Agrippina had a tumultuous relationship following Germanicus's passing, and eventually he had her exiled, along with her brother, after they were accused of treason. Caligula went to live with his great-grandmother, but when she also passed away, he lived with his grandmother. Caligula's brothers were declared public enemies and also exiled, and he, along with his 3 sisters, remained in Rome as hostages. Tiberius eventually passed away in 37 AD, and while it was speculated that Caligula may have been responsible, he was still crowned emperor. But with this newfound sense of power, came some very serious issues. Caligula was now allowed to do as he pleased, creating laws as he pleased and breaking them at will. He ruled with an iron fist, and his subjects didn't dare oppose him in any way. He would often start affairs with his officials' wives and openly boast to them about what he had done. He had little regard for the lives of others, and on one occasion, he was attending a ceremony during which he was meant to end the life of a bull by striking it with a hammer, but he decided to use the weapon against the attending priest instead, ending his life for no reason. He soon became obsessed with gold and acquiring more of it. He would spread gold coins across his floor so that he could walk on them. He would have gold loaves of bread on his dinner table and drink cocktails made from vinegar and melted pearls. He was so enamored with his own image that he had a temple built and dedicated it to himself. He had a golden statue made of himself and placed in this temple, after which he ordered his staff to dress it in the same clothing that he wore each day. Keep in mind that he was enjoying ridiculously expensive meals, having affairs with many different women, and having golden statues erected, and many of his subjects were struggling to find work and food to eat, but he remained unbothered. He ended up having many of his senators executed, ordered that Tiberius's grandson's life be ended, and insulted a member of the Praetorian Guard, which led to his downfall. He'd become unpopular with the Roman elite, and in 41 AD, his advisors conspired to have his life ended, finally bringing his reign of terror to an end. Pablo Escobar, the famous Colombian man whose name is synonymous with illegal substances, was born in 1949, and even in his teenage years, he was regularly in trouble with the law. His first criminal enterprise involved selling fake diplomas, stealing tombstones from cemeteries for resale, and smuggling stereo equipment. He also started selling counterfeit cigarettes and stealing vehicles, while also selling fake lottery tickets. As an adult, he became involved in the sale and smuggling of illegal substances, and on several occasions kidnapped his victims only to set them free once his demanded ransom was paid. He established smuggling routes to Peru after establishing his own cartel, and before long also started smuggling illegal substances to Ecuador and Bolivia. This was merely the start of a massive empire that he would eventually rule over with the aid of the Nicaraguan Sandinista government and Cuba. He started targeting government officials for assassination, and before long he was smuggling about 70 tons of illegal substances into the U.S. As is to be expected, he was often confronted by the police, politicians, and even the public, which led to violent events that cost many people their lives, but never Escobar's. Even police officers and judges weren't safe if they opposed him. Thanks to his illegal activities, he soon became one of the richest people in the world, earning around $420 million a week. He bought private planes, several expensive houses, and hosted lavish parties that were attended by his colleagues and members of other crime syndicates. Before long, he had so much money that he didn't know what to do with it, and so he resorted to storing it in warehouses and burying it in fields. Hence, much of the cash deteriorated and was never found. At his most valuable home, the $36 million Hacienda Napoles mansion, he had a soccer field built, dinosaur statues erected, a bullfighting arena installed, and eventually he established a zoo. He also had an airstrip, which meant that he could fly to and from the mansion whenever he needed to. In the zoo, he kept zebras, elephants, ostriches, camels, and giraffes, most of which were illegally smuggled into the country. He was also known as a ruthless killer who would have no second thoughts about having someone's life ended if they stood against him or even disagreed with him. It's estimated that by his orders, as many as 4,000 people were executed, and on one occasion, he went so far as to have a plane blown up since he believed a man who was working with the police against him was aboard. He was eventually forced to go on the run from the law, but suggested that he turn himself in on one condition, that he build the prisons where he were to be incarcerated. This suggestion was accepted, and he built the La Cathedral prison. The building contained fax machines, phones, computers, a pool, sauna, waterfall, and a nightclub. He remained there for a while, but after ordering the execution of 2 rivals in prison, he was slated to be relocated to a normal prison. But he escaped before this could be done. He retreated to his hideout in Medellin, to where he was tracked, and in the resulting firefight, he was wounded and lost his life. Many people believe that if Escobar weren't a sociopath, he would never have been involved with these illegal activities as a teenager, and perhaps his life would have been very different. Genghis Khan, one of the most successful leaders of all time, is known as a brilliant strategist and talented military innovator. But today he's considered to have been a sociopath who would stop at nothing to conquer as many areas as he could. Khan and his two sons used their brilliant military strategies to conquer tribes from the Adriatic to the Pacific Ocean, and managed to make their way to Finland, Hungary, Croatia, Poland, Vietnam, and Japan, to name just a few countries. Before long, Khan had amassed an empire the size of Africa, and by 1240, he'd conquered most of the planet. Or so it was thought, since Australasia and the Americas remained unknown to the Mongols of the time. While this seemed like an impossible feat for just one group of warriors, the truth is that Khan fought battles on more than one front at a time, and many people believe that he achieved the success he did thanks to the Mongols' expertise at archery. They were excellent horsemen and were able to hit small targets at a distance while galloping at speed. This was a skill that much of the world hadn't learned yet, which meant that Khan's forces were superior. Furthermore, he lived by a code of surrender or die, and most enemies who faced him would quickly adopt for the former to avoid the latter. Some historians consider him to be a genius who was ahead of his time, while others believe he was a barbaric leader who would cut through his enemies without remorse or a second thought. It's also been suggested that his sociopathic tendencies stemmed from his childhood, which was far from ideal. At the age of 9, enemies of his father poisoned him, and his mother was exiled from their tribe. This meant that she had to raise her 7 children alone, and Khan was left to hunt and provide for the family. It's also believed that while still young, he and his half-brother got into an argument over food, and that he ended his life as a result. He got married while he was still a teenager, but shortly afterward, he and his wife were abducted by a rival tribe, and he was forced into slavery. He managed to escape, and by the time that he became an adult, he'd learned to fight as a warrior, and he started gathering an army. He spoke to the leaders of nearby tribes, with whom he forged alliances. This started the conquests of Genghis Khan, who set out to conquer the world. It's believed that as many as 40 million people lost their lives thanks to his campaigns, which resulted in the whole planet's population being reduced by 11%. Considering that Bernie Madoff ran one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history, it isn't surprising to learn that he was a sociopath. In order to pull off such a scheme, one needs a disregard for the well-being of others, since he knowingly stole money from many people, but was seemingly unaffected by their loss. In fact, after his nefarious dealings were uncovered, and he was forced to face justice for what he had done, he claimed that the 2 decades that he spent deceiving investors, some of which were his friends, put him under a massive amount of strain, and that his victims were as much to blame as he was. He added that when his investors realized he could achieve double-digit returns, they should have realized that not all was as it seemed. This is a classic sociopathic trait in which blame is shifted from the guilty person in order to garner sympathy, when it's in no way justified. Madoff has, however, repeatedly insisted that he isn't a sociopath, and that he's been unfairly painted by the media as a criminal who set out to deceive people from the very beginning. He claims that when he started trading, he did it by the book. But according to him, he then met some unscrupulous people who forced him to take losses and then failed to compensate him. He says he had no other choice but to turn to a life of deceit and crime, once again blaming his decisions on others. It all started in 1980, though Madoff would have the world believe that he only started running his Ponzi scheme in 1992. He started collecting millions of dollars from individuals, hedge funds, charitable organizations, and pension funds, claiming that he had the unique trading strategy that will see his investors raking in a lot of money. But this was all a ruse, as it was later discovered he'd never traded any shares for his clients' accounts. He continuously showed positive returns that by the year 2000 caught the attention of Harry Markopoulos, a financial analyst who then alerted the authorities. He continued to report Madoff's shady dealings, but for reasons unknown, the U.S. Security and Exchange Commission failed to act for several more years. By 2008, his clients had started requesting redemptions to the tune of $7 billion, but he was unable to come up with the money. He then admitted to his sons that the entire business was one big scam, and that he had defrauded his investors of about $50 billion, though the amount was later alleged by prosecutors to be as high as $64 billion. In December of 2008, he could no longer hide his deception from the authorities, and he handed himself over to the police. He could offer no explanation at the time, but in the years since, he's pointed his finger at many people in an effort to absolve himself of blame. All of his assets were frozen, and a judge appointed a trustee to restore his 4,800 victims' money that he had lost. He eventually pleaded guilty to all the charges against him. Charles Manson needs no introduction to those with an interest in serial killers, since he's likely the most famous one of all time. In 1967, he'd already spent time in prison when he decided to move to the Spawn Movie Ranch, where he proceeded to gather followers, eventually creating a group that he called the Family. He told his followers that he was pursuing a career as a musician, and he had ties to some famous musicians like the Beach Boys, who recorded one of his songs. But in reality, he was a sociopath who would go on to order his family to end the lives of several people. Whether the family was a cult or not is a subject that's still being debated today. But whatever the case may be, he was a cunning and charming man who could easily convince people to do his bidding, and he used this to his advantage to wreak havoc in California. There's no doubt he had a difficult childhood, which likely contributed to his sociopathic nature. He never knew his father, and his mother was a 16-year-old who was sent to prison for robbery. He was then sent to live with his uncle and aunt in West Virginia, but he was soon in trouble with the law himself, and was sent to several different juvenile facilities, and later on, prison. He started committing robberies, larceny, and auto theft, but seemingly wasn't very good at any of these. He moved to San Francisco in 1967 after being released from prison, and by the next year, he'd gathered his followers on the ranch. He used science fiction and the occult in his religious teachings, claiming that a race war was about to break out that would result in the end of the United States. In 1969, he enacted his plan and ordered members of the family to travel to the house of Roman Polanski, where they ended the lives of Sharon Tate, Jay Sabry, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, and Stephen Parent. But they were not the group's only victims, as they ended the lives of Lino LaBianca and his wife Rosemary the following night, also at the orders of their leader, Manson. But they would not get away with their crimes for long. The cult members who were involved were tracked down and arrested, along with Manson. The resulting trial captivated the U.S., but the proceedings were often interrupted by members of the family, who loitered outside the courtroom, many of whom carried sharpened blades. They also attempted to dissuade witnesses from testifying, and in the courtroom, Manson on one occasion attempted to attack the judge after he was denied permission to cross-examine a witness. When Manson was called upon to testify, the jury was removed from the courtroom, as it was believed he'd be able to influence them with his charm. He made several confusing and erratic statements, often blaming music from the time of what had happened. When he appeared at the penalty phase of his trial, he had shaved his head, stating that he was the devil, and that the devil had always had a bald head. He and his co-conspirators were all sentenced to be executed, but this was later changed to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would, however, pass away while still incarcerated in 2017, and today he's remembered as one of the scariest serial killers in modern history. Many historians claim that Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator who ruled over that area for 25 years, exerted more political power than any other leader in all of history. Many people aren't aware that he actually wasn't born in Russia, but rather Georgia, which lies on the Black Sea. He grew up poor since his father was a cobbler who suffered from a drinking problem. He would regularly assault Stalin, but this ended when Stalin decided to relocate to Tiflis Theological Seminary, where he started studying the writings of Karl Marx, leading to his interest in communism. In 1899, he was expelled for what was described as revolutionary activity. though some sources state that he left of his own volition when he fell ill. For a short time, he became a clerk at the Tiflis Observatory, and this is believed to be the only paid job that he ever had, other than during his career in politics. The following year, he participated in demonstrations and strikes after joining the political underground, but he soon became unpopular as he was fond of violence and goading his fellow protesters in clashes with the police. In 1903, he joined the Bolsheviks, a wing of the Russian Empire that competed directly with the Mensheviks. He became a devout follower of Lenin and was arrested on several occasions for more revolutionary activities. He would often escape, though, leading many people to believe that he was working with the imperial police. Lenin promoted him to serve on the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party, and when his son was taken prisoner by German soldiers during World War II, he refused to secure his release in a suggested prisoner exchange. He continued to rise through the political ranks and eventually became the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. He was known to be a ruthless ruler, but the worst was yet to come. In 1934, he decided to get rid of his rivals during a series of mock trials known as the Moscow Trials. Anyone who opposed him was removed from office without warning, many of whom were then imprisoned or executed. Members of the Red Army and military high command were also put on trial, wreaking havoc on the military. Known as the Stalin Purges, hundreds of thousands of people were accused of different crimes such as espionage and sabotage, and when found guilty, their lives were ended, or they were sent to labor camps. His aim was to create an atmosphere of fear in the Soviet Union, but he suddenly changed his mind and condemned the executions that had been carried out. He had the chiefs of the NKVD who'd carried out the execution arrested, and their lives were ended. The purges had finally come to an end, but by that time between 700,000 and 1.2 million people had lost their lives thanks to Stalin's paranoia and sociopathic tendencies. He remained as paranoid as ever, and for the next few decades, the Soviet Union existed in an atmosphere of fear, as surveillance was constantly being carried out. King Leopold II of Belgium is remembered for the many atrocities that he committed in Africa after becoming king in 1865. He decided that Belgium should become an imperial power, and to this aim, he developed the Congo River Basin and created the Congo Free State, which is now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. He persuaded people in Africa that he was a philanthropist who was bringing Christianity to the continent, and he employed explorer Henry Morton Stanley to survey the Congo River Basin, after which he established trading posts and roads. He then persuaded local tribe chiefs to sign treaties with Belgium, all the while being aware that they were illiterate and likely had no idea what they were agreeing to. When the treaties were signed, they were altered after the fact to suit Leopold's whims. He claimed a large portion of Africa as his own personal property, and somehow convinced the US and larger countries in Europe that this was indeed the case. He named it the Congo Free State, which then became a private colony that he ruled over as he saw fit. His end goal was to enrich himself using the territories that he had claimed. He started dealing in ivory, but when rubber became a popular material all over the world, he decided to abandon the ivory trade, believing he could make even more money by processing rubber trees. By this time, he'd amassed an army of 19,000 soldiers. They were called the Force Publique, and what followed illustrated Leopold's sociopathic nature. He ordered his army to march into villages, after which they would gather the women and children. They were then told to go into the rainforest to gather rubber trees, and that their loved ones would then be released once they'd reached the predetermined quota each month. But as use of rubber became more popular, its price soared, and the quotas were increased to impossible amounts. Soon, the trees close to these villages were gone, and the men were forced to walk miles to find new trees, all the while fearing that their families would be executed. Those who were not sent into the forests were forced to build roads and chop wood that was used to power steamboats. But many of these workers lost their lives due to being overworked, and in the villages, people started starving since they had no food to eat. People in the neighboring villages fled after learning of the atrocities being committed, and after hiding in the forests, they struggled to survive, as there was precious little to eat. In a few cases, villagers attempted to start a resistance, but were promptly executed. Thanks to the resulting famine, Diseases started to break out in the villages, resulting in more lives being lost. The birth rate among the villagers dropped dramatically, and it's estimated that the population dropped as much as 50%. The international community eventually took notice of Leopold's actions, and he had no choice but to give up his ill-gotten territories, but he insisted that he be compensated for the loss by the Belgian government. Leopold eventually passed away in 1909 after suffering an embolism. From an early age, Ismail Enver Pasha showed signs that he would become a great leader one day. He was one of the organizers of the 1980 Young Turk Revolution, and in 1911, he was instrumental in defending Libya against Italian forces. He became a member of the Imperial Ottoman family after marrying Najia Sultan, and he was appointed as the Minister of War. He entered into an alliance with Germany, but suffered a bad defeat at the border outpost of Sarikamish in Armenia, where he then decided to lead a campaign against Russia. This seemingly brought his sociopathic nature out into the open, as he took the defeat badly and turned on the Armenian soldiers and his army. He ordered that they all be stripped of their weapons and titles, after which they were sent to labor battalions, but there they were summarily executed. To explain this abhorrent behavior, he claimed that all of these soldiers had committed treason, which was of course a lie. He then turned to the Armenian public and decided to enact his vengeance on them as well. He utilized a branch of the Ottoman military known as the Special Organization, which was kept secret from the public. The organization was led by a doctor named Behedin Shakir, and he, along with his staff, was ordered to end as many Armenian lives as he could. In 1915, Pasha ordered that all Armenian political organizations in the Ottoman Empire be disbanded, and that any Armenian people who were associated with these organizations be arrested. He asserted that these groups were being influenced by outside forces such as Russia, and that this was causing upheavals within the Ottoman military. In just 2 days, as many as 270 Armenians were taken into custody. This included politicians, members of the clergy, doctors, writers, journalists, teachers, and lawyers, among others. Most of those arrested were then executed, and this is considered by many historians to be the beginning of Pasha's worst atrocities. He then ordered that a mass deportation of Armenians be carried out, and after this was done, those who were forced out of the country received no aid from the Ottoman Empire, and they were forced to march through the Armenian desert with no food, water, or shelter. When some of the world's politicians found out about these deportations, they confronted him, and on several occasions he was met by Henry Morgenthau, the U.S. ambassador at the time. He tried to dissuade Pasha from this practice, but Pasha stood firm, stating that his policy of deportation would not be changed in any way. He added that he was happy for the Armenian people to live in the desert, and that he would not allow them anywhere near Anatolia. He then went one step further and demanded that Morgenthau hand over the names of anyone who held insurance policies belonging to Armenian people, so that these funds could be used by his state, but his request was promptly dismissed. Pasha then stated that any further attempts to dissuade him would be futile, as he'd already managed to end the lives of 3/4 of the Armenian people. But he would meet his end in August of 1922, when Yakov Melkumov, the commander of the Armenian Red Army, launched a surprise attack against him. Joanna Denny, who's now known to be a serial killer, showed no signs of sociopathy while she was a child. She was born in St. Albans in Hertfordshire, England, in 1982, and while she later claimed that she was abused as a child, no supporting evidence has ever been found. She and her younger sister had a very normal childhood, according to her friends and family, and the siblings were very close, so much so that they created their own secret language that only they understood. She loved playing with her dolls, and would often play with makeup, dress in fancy outfits, and try out different hairstyles while playing. Those who knew the family have stated that her parents were strict, but never became overly protective. She was a good student while attending Roundwood Park School in Harpenden, and she was slated to attend university once she graduated from high school. Her parents hoped that she'd become a lawyer, and didn't spare any expense on extra lessons. She was also physically fit, as she played for her school's hockey and netball teams, and by all accounts, she seemed like any other normal teenager. But she soon started hanging out with a group of older boys, and she started skipping lessons. She then ran away from home with 20-year-old John Traynor, when she was just 15 years old, and her family frantically searched for her. The pair was eventually found living in a wasteland area not far from their house. But by this time, things had started going very wrong for Joanna. She had become addicted to illegal substances, drinking alcohol, and when she turned 16, she decided to leave the family home to forge a life for herself. But she would run out of money and had to resort to asking her family for aid. She and Traynor moved to Milton Keynes, and before long they had 2 children. She told her parents that they could see the children only if they paid for the privilege, and hence their relationship ended there. She was unfaithful to Traynor and had affairs with different men and women over the next few years. She would sometimes disappear for a few weeks at a time, and upon her return home, begged Traynor to forgive her. The couple then moved to East Anglia, where she worked on farms, but her behavior became even worse. She regularly assaulted Traynor and started telling her friends that she wanted to know what it felt like to end someone's life. Traynor eventually had enough, and in 2009, he decided to take the children to start a new life elsewhere. Joanna's bad behavior continued, and at times she resorted to street work to support her addictions. She was eventually arrested, after which it was discovered that she showed sociopathic tendencies, for which she received treatment, but she was also diagnosed as a masochist later on. Then, in March of 2013, Joanna's life took the ultimate turn for the worse. She'd met a man named Lukas Slabashevsky, who shared her love of alcohol and prohibited substances, and she invited him to meet her at an address in Peterborough. Upon his arrival, he was expecting the usual alcohol and illegal substances, but as soon as he stepped inside, Joanna lunged at him with a sharpened blade and ended his life. She then ended the life of her roommate, John Chapman, and her landlord, Kevin Lee, who was also her boss. She fled to Hereford, where she tried to end the lives of 2 more men, but failed. She was arrested after a manhunt and sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison. Number 10. When the Varsity Blues scandal broke in 2019, influencer Olivia Jade didn't realize the seriousness of what her parents had done. They were both rich and famous celebrities, and it wasn't unusual for people like them to use that money and influence to get the best for their children. But the family had gone one step further than what was legal, and Olivia herself was caught up in the lie. The scandal surrounded one man, Rick Singer. He ran a company specializing in helping the children of rich and influential people get into top universities. But rather than coaching them for tests or helping to write essays, Singer's company paid bribes and helped to cheat in exams. Among the many parents that came to Singer for help were actress Lori Loughlin and her fashion designer husband, Massimo Giannulli. They first wanted help getting Olivia's sister into the University of South California. When it came to Olivia's time to apply for college, they enlisted this help again. Singer used various methods to get students a place at university. Some were given the answers to exam questions beforehand. Others took their exams in special centers, where proctors would change their answers after the tests were handed in. But with the Giannulli family, he took an approach that meant they wouldn't have to rely on exams. Olivia and her sister were tagged as athletic recruits. They would get into USC due to their experience and talent in competitive rowing. The problem with this was the fact that neither of them had any experience rowing. Olivia posed for photos on rowing equipment, which were supposed to support her academic credentials. For some of the students involved in the scandal, it's possible they had no idea just what their parents were doing. Olivia may not have known the full extent of the wrongdoings, but she was aware that she had no rowing experience. The fact that Olivia was pegged as an athletic recruit seemed strange to her school guidance counselor. He knew she was not a rower. Giannulli coached Olivia on what to say to get out of trouble with him. After the lies and a large bribe, Olivia was accepted into the university. She talked about going to school on her YouTube channel, where she said she wasn't looking forward to actually learning, but she was much more interested in the social events. Olivia was already enrolled in the university when news of the scandal broke. Her parents were arrested for fraud and bribery. Olivia and her sister were never arrested or charged for any crimes, though. Olivia would later tell the media that she didn't realize that they had done anything wrong. She was familiar with other rich and famous people making donations to universities, and she assumed that that was all her parents had done. Number 9. For most people, coming under enemy fire while flying over a war zone could be a terrifying and memorable experience. It's not surprising then that news anchor Brian Williams told his story of going through just that multiple times in the decades after the 2003 incident. The only problem with this was that the story was a lie. Brian Williams began working as a correspondent for NBC Nightly News in 1993. In 2004, he replaced the retiring Tom Brokaw as an anchor, as well as managing editor for the show. For the next 10 years, Williams was a reliable figure who many trusted to deliver honest news. When he wasn't delivering the news, he was making appearances on shows like The Daily Show and The Late Show with David Letterman. While on Letterman in 2013, he retold a story from his time covering the beginnings of the war in Iraq. According to Williams, he was flying in a convoy of Chinook helicopters when they came under fire from enemies on the ground. The helicopter he and his team were flying in was struck by a projectile and took damage. All the helicopters in the convoy dropped their loads and were forced to land in the middle of the desert. Luckily, he was flying with the U.S. tank platoon, who surrounded the downed helicopters and protected the stranded crew members from enemies on the ground. Most of the viewers at home would have been amazed by the story, but there were a few watching who were more familiar with what happened. They'd actually been in the helicopter in question, and they had no memory of Williams being there. Nobody called Williams out for it at the time, though. In January of 2015, Williams told the story again. This time, he was on the nightly news and attempting to make a segment praising the work of one of the soldiers who'd kept him and the rest of the team safe. After the show, NBC posted a clip to their Facebook page that gave the soldiers who were actually there the perfect place to reveal the truth. What Williams described had actually happened. A group of helicopters did come under attack and were forced to land. Thankfully, nobody was injured, but the helicopters were badly damaged. It was over half an hour later that the helicopters carrying Williams and his team arrived. They were part of a different group, with the soldiers working on entirely different missions. The team had been following the story of the attack over the radio, and Williams had been very excited by it. When they landed, they filmed the damaged aircraft before leaving after a sandstorm passed. After being called out, Williams replied to the Facebook comments, admitting to the lie. He would later apologize on the news show, but even with the apology came a lie. He now claimed that they'd been following directly behind the helicopter that had been attacked, the same story that was reported in 2003, shortly after the incident actually happened. After 12 years, the memory of the event and the story they reported on became blurred together, and Williams remembered incorrectly. As investigations began into Williams' reporting, more lies were uncovered. Some were simple exaggerations of stories throughout the years, while others were completely false. After the investigation, Williams was demoted to breaking news anchor, but remained on air until 2021. Number 8. In 2005, tennis player Mariano Puerta was at the top of his career. But that would all come crashing down when he tested positive for a banned substance. It was a foul that could have ended his career, but a lie stopped Puerta from receiving a harsh punishment. In June of 2005, Puerta made it to the finals of the French Open. He faced off against Rafael Nadal. Like Puerta, Nadal had never made it to a Grand Slam final before. Nadal took the victory, and Puerta earned a career best of runner-up. The tennis world already moved on to other championships when news started to break that one of the Argentinian players had tested positive for a banned substance. There were a few players who could have been at fault, and Puerta denied that he was the one who'd been caught. But by December, it was clear that he was the person who tested positive. This would be Puerta's second offense. Years earlier, Puerta had tested positive for clenbuterol. It was a chemical found in asthma medication, but it also led to performance-enhancing applications, so it was listed as banned. He received a 9-month suspension as a penalty. If Puerta was found guilty again, he risked a lifetime ban. The substance this time was etilofrine. Like the other substance, it had medical uses but was still banned. Puerta claimed he had not knowingly ingested the substance. Before the news broke, he told reporters he didn't even drink orange juice because he was so worried about accidentally taking something he shouldn't have. But he couldn't control what the people around him were doing. He told the court that his wife had taken the medication to help with her menstrual pain. He then had drunk from the same glass, which had been contaminated with the medication. The substance was only found in trace amounts and was far lower than what would be needed to actually make a difference in Puerta's performance. Considering all this, the court didn't want to punish Puerta too harshly as a penalty. He was suspended for 8 years, but even this they felt was too harsh. Later, it was reduced to 2 years. It would still seriously cripple his career, but Puerta was able to play competitively again in 2007. Puerta's career never reached the same heights as it had before his ban. He picked up some wins again, but retired in 2009. It was only years after this retirement that Puerta admitted the truth. According to Puerta, he had taken pills supplied by a friend of his trainer. They included caffeine and ginseng, which Puerta knew about. It also had trace amounts of the banned substance. That shouldn't have gotten Puerta into too much trouble, but he admitted that the pills had been supplied through less than legal means. Number 7. By the time Brian Dennehy made his acting debut, he'd already served with the US Marine Corps for 5 years. His experience gave him an authentic edge to some of his portrayals, but he always emphasized that real wars were nothing like the movies. He would talk about his experience in the Vietnam War and the wounds he got for serving his country. But in 1999, it was revealed that this was all a lie. The subject of the Vietnam War came up a lot in interviews with Dennehy. While promoting his movie, The Belly of an Architect, he claimed that his experience in Vietnam liberated him. He told interviewers that his early acting career was put on hold as he was forced into compulsory service. While there, he realized just how short life could be. Tens of thousands of US soldiers lost their lives in the conflict. Even though Dennehy managed to make it out alive, he realized that life could be over in an instant. When he returned to civilian life, he decided to chase the career he really wanted. Dennehy started acting on stage. It was only 2 years after the end of the Vietnam War that he made his movie debut. The first few roles were minor, but he found regular work, and after a few years, he was taking on more lead roles. In 1982, the film that made him famous was released. Dennehy played Sheriff Will Teasel in the first Rambo movie, where he led a manhunt against troubled Vietnam War veteran John Rambo. Naturally, Dennehy's own experience would again be a popular topic in interviews about the film. Dennehy didn't want to glamorize his experience. He tried to emphasize that real wars were nothing like what was portrayed in the movies, and things were far more chaotic and not at all simple. When asked if he'd ever taken a life, Dennehy claimed that in conflict, any act like that was almost accidental. He emphasized that they were always trying to remain out of combat and avoid face-to-face confrontations. The true answer to that question was no, he'd never taken anyone's life. He hadn't served in Vietnam or in any other war for that matter. Brian Dennehy had been in the US Marines for 5 years between 1958 and 1963. War had started years earlier in Vietnam, but it wasn't until after the end of Dennehy's service that US combat troops were sent into the conflict. Rather than fighting in chaotic battles, Dennehy had been in Okinawa, where he played football for the Corps. Dennehy hadn't been wounded by shrapnel like he claimed, or any other way. Dennehy's life was called out in the 1999 book Stolen Valor. An actual Vietnam War veteran, B.G. Burkett, had been investigating claims by others pretending to have experiences in the same war. He was startled by just how many people lied about being Vietnam War veterans. Many had never even left their country. According to Burkett, the liars helped to share myths about the war and about the veterans. They helped to solidify the image of veterans as unemployed people who blamed the war for everything wrong in their lives, while Burkett claimed it wasn't the truth for most veterans. Dennehy may not have tried to promote that image, but he did lie about his experiences. After the lie was revealed, he confessed. He claimed he made up the story when he was a young man and then couldn't figure out a way to take it back. But even after Dennehy confessed to the lie, he still continued to claim to be a Vietnam veteran in later interviews. Number 6. In October of 2019, celebrity Colleen Rooney made a social media post that led to a media frenzy. She accused her former friend, Rebecca Vardy, of leaking stories about her to the press. Vardy denied it and tried to sue for libel. Her lies in the resulting court case were reported around the world. Like a lot of celebrities, Colleen Rooney had a private Instagram account, which only close friends and family members could view. There, she would share moments she didn't want the rest of the world to see. This was especially the case in September of 2017. Her husband, footballer Wayne Rooney, was in trouble with the police for drunk driving. It was obviously a stressful time for the family, and Colleen was worried about their marriage. She took their children to stay with her parents for a while and made a post about it on her private Instagram account. Not long after, the tabloid newspaper The Sun ran a story about the Rooneys, which quoted word for word Colleen's private post. She knew that someone she trusted had leaked the story, but she wasn't sure who. At the start of 2019, more stories from her account were leaked. Rooney had begun to suspect the wife of another footballer, a woman named Rebecca Vardy. The two had never been especially close friends, but she did have access to the private account. When Colleen was having problems, Vardy would message her and act friendly, but it seemed suspicious. Colleen changed the settings on her Instagram account, making it so that only Vardy could see certain stories. Then she made posts about going to Mexico to help having a baby girl, and the basement of her home flooding. The stories were completely fictional, but it was just believable enough. Both times, the stories later appeared in the Sun newspaper. The only way the paper could have gotten information on the stories was from the posts on Colleen's Instagram account, and the only person who could see those posts was Vardy, or someone using her account. Rooney broke the news in October of 2019. Vardy immediately denied any wrongdoing. Rooney had proof that only Vardy's account had seen the posts about the flood and Mexico trip, but Vardy claimed someone else must have had access to her account, but very few people believed her. In 2020, Vardy decided to take action against Rooney to clear her name. She tried to sue Rooney for libel. In libel cases, the best defense is that the person accused was telling the truth. It's not possible to sue for damages if those damages were caused by an accurate statement. Rooney was tasked with proving that Vardy was the person responsible for the leaks. In a week-long court case, text messages between Vardy and her agent were shown. The messages talked about leaking stories to the press, but only a small fraction of them could be viewed. Vardy claimed to have lost messages when she changed her cell phone. It was an excuse even her own expert thought was remarkable. Her agent's phone was also lost. It had been dropped overboard while on a boat in the North Sea. The defense team also showed how Vardy arranged for paparazzi to take photos of herself and other footballers' wives and girlfriends without their knowledge, and was seen trying to sit as close to Rooney as possible at matches. After a lengthy deliberation, the judge found in favor of Rooney. Vardy had been the one to leak the stories, and the judge described her evidence as inconsistent with documentary evidence, evasive, and implausible. Number 5. Brian Johnson made a name for himself as the social media star The Liver King. He amassed millions of followers as a fitness influencer, showing off his strength and physique in extreme challenges. He claimed all of this had been achieved through a so-called ancestral lifestyle. But in December of 2022, he admitted this was a lie. The fitness and diet industry is a big business. Research into human health is always evolving, and for many people, it can be difficult to keep up with what's considered the healthiest diet. It's much easier to turn to people who have apparently achieved the best lifestyle and take their advice. Body image problems and conditions like muscle dysphoria are also a growing issue. More and more people suffering from these conditions turn to the people they want to look like for answers. In 2021, Johnson became one of those people. By the time he started posting on social media as the Liver King, he already had a successful business selling supplements built on his ancestral lifestyle philosophy. Johnson didn't invent the idea of returning to a simpler way of living. Many fitness and lifestyle influencers share the idea that eating like stereotypical cavemen is how the human body is supposed to survive. Even though scientists disagree that our ancestors actually ate the diets these influencers are promoting, the theory has gained a lot of followers. But while Johnson wasn't the only person promoting this, he made a brand as being more extreme. Johnson claimed to be adding back elements to his life that had been removed by modern living. This meant eating a diet of raw animal organs, tough physical exercise, and stereotypical masculinity. One early video script included Johnson bringing in grocery shopping, but he scrapped it as he didn't believe this was a man's job. Johnson had the appearance to back up the claims that the lifestyle was best for keeping physically fit. Comments on his Instagram and TikTok videos included people asking if he modeled or suggesting he get into competitive bodybuilding. It was a lifestyle he sold to his fans, or primals as he called them. He promoted that anybody could develop his physique and that the lifestyle also improved the mental health of young men. But almost as soon as Johnson made his social media debut, other fitness influencers were skeptical that everything was as natural as he claimed. Johnson was interviewed by media outlets and podcasts, and the question of performance-enhancing substances would come up a lot. Each time, Johnson denied taking any hormones or similar substances to get his physique. In 2022, he was confronted with evidence that he could not deny. Another YouTuber named More Plates, More Dates posted an hour-long video titled The Liver King Lie. The video included emails sent by Johnson where he outlined just what substances he was taking. In the email, he claimed to have been working out for 35 years, but as he reached his mid-40s, he was finding it harder and harder to keep up the lifestyle. He was working with a pharmacy to figure out a mixture of hormones and substances to help him, which amounted to $11,000 a month. Johnson continued to post videos on his social media channels after this, but he no longer gets the attention that he previously received. Number 4. In January of 2013, a sports news website broke a very strange story about a college football player, Notre Dame's Manti Te'o, who'd been one of the stars of the season and gained admiration for his strength and perseverance in the wake of the passing of his grandmother and girlfriend. A tip sent to the website revealed that not everything was as it seemed. According to Te'o, he met his girlfriend back in 2009. She was a student at Stanford University, and they met when Te'o played a game against the Stanford team. Her name was Lene Kekwa, and she had Samoan ancestry like Te'o. They exchanged phone numbers and over the next few years talked often. Kekwa was interested in football. She was also multilingual and a gifted musician, according to Te'o. They would meet up when both visited Hawaii, and over time, a romantic relationship began. Te'o's college football career was growing alongside his relationship. By 2012, he was one of the star players, and through that season, he helped the Notre Dame Fighting Irish to 12 victories. Things began to get difficult in Te'o's home life at some point in early 2012. Kekwa had been in a car accident and was rushed to the hospital. Te'o couldn't be by her side, but would phone her every night. They would fall asleep while on the phone. While in the hospital, Kekwa learned she had leukemia. She seemed to be responding to treatment and was actually released from the hospital on September 10th, but the following day, things took a turn for the worse again. She passed away either that night or the following day, within hours of Te'o's grandmother. It was devastating to the young footballer, but he'd promised his girlfriend he would play in her honor. He helped win the game against Michigan State that weekend. A look back at news reports from the time showed some inconsistencies, but it was nothing that anybody picked up. It would be easy to confuse some details given everything he had been through. But this wasn't simple confusion. Lene Kekwa never existed. It was all a hoax. When the story first broke in January of 2013, it was assumed that Te'o was in on the scheme. He'd allegedly met her multiple times, and it seemed impossible that he didn't know. But the truth was, he had no idea that it was all a scam until December. Months after Kekwa supposedly passed away, he received a call from someone claiming to be her. She even sent photos as proof of life. She claimed she'd faked her passing to escape people related to illegal substances. Te'o had lied about meeting Kekwa before, as he didn't want his family to believe he was in on a relationship with someone he'd never met. But he truly had no idea that Kekwa was playing him the whole time. Number 3. For years, the life of Elizabeth Finch sounded like something out of the show she worked on, Grey's Anatomy. She lived with an extremely rare cancer that required ongoing treatment. She'd gone through a series of traumatic incidents that left her with crippling mental health conditions, and she had to end life support treatment for a brother who'd been cruel to her growing up. But the stories were just that, stories. Finch worked on Grey's Anatomy from 2015 to 2022, writing 13 episodes and producing 172. Some of the storylines introduced to the show came from Finch's own life, or at least the life that she told her friends and coworkers about. It had been one of these stories that earned her the role in the first place. While working on another show, she was diagnosed with an extremely rare form of bone cancer. But even though the doctors didn't give her much hope, she persevered and continued to work alongside her treatment. She also wrote an essay about her experience for the magazine Elle. Showrunners at Grey's Anatomy were impressed by her work, and Finch joined the team soon after. Finch became the show's expert on cancer. Her illness meant she was continuously going through treatment and had more experience in that area than anybody else. That included other survivors who worked on the show. She introduced a storyline where a character had the same form of cancer that she did and battled with doctors in the same way that she had. But it wasn't only her own life that Finch found inspiration in. Another storyline came from a traumatic story told by a friend. Away from work, one of Finch's friends was a victim of a violent attack. Finch took time away from work to help deal with the loss and had to seek help from a mental health facility. It was there she met her future wife, another patient at the facility named Jennifer. The two became close friends, and after their treatment, they started a romance together. In early 2020, they were married. Not long after this, Finch's lies began to unravel. Jennifer was a trained nurse and noticed some of the holes in Finch's stories. Scrolling through her social media account, she realized Finch hadn't lost her eyebrows or eyelashes during chemotherapy treatment. There were also photos showing bandages over a spot where a chemo port would have been. But Jennifer knew Finch didn't have a port scar there. The bandages were shoddily done and not the work of a medical professional. There was also evidence of other lies. Finch's story about losing a friend in a violent attack was untrue. She'd previously told coworkers her brother had lost his life, but he was alive and well, working as a doctor in Florida. Finch was confronted about the lies. At first, she tried to claim that she had once had cancer. When she recovered, she continued the story because she liked the attention. But the lack of a port scar proved this was still a lie. Elizabeth Finch never had cancer. There'd been no ongoing treatment and no complications. She never had a kidney transplant. In 2022, Disney opened an investigation into Finch's lies, and she was placed on administrative leave before resigning. Number 2. Tonya Harding is one of the most famous figure skaters to have never won an Olympic medal. Her ice skating career was cut short after her ex-husband orchestrated an attack against her rival in 1994. For decades, Harding insisted she had no prior knowledge of the attack. It wasn't until an ABC special about her, titled Truth and Lies, that she admitted the truth. The 1994 Winter Olympics were held in Norway in February. The United States was allowed to send 2 athletes for the ladies' singles event, and there was fierce competition to earn the spots. The previous Olympic gold medalist, Kristi Yamaguchi, had retired, and Harding looked set to take over as the US's top figure skater. But there were others hoping to take that spot. Among them was Nancy Kerrigan, who won a bronze medal at the 1992 Winter Olympics. The decision of who would be selected for the Olympic team hinged on their performances at the US Figure Skating Championships. Before the event, other skaters had received threats. A news report from the time stated even Harding was scared for her safety and had hired bodyguards to protect her. Kerrigan wasn't taking any such precautions. On the night of January 6th, after practice for the event, Kerrigan was attacked. She was struck by a baton-like object in the leg. The aftermath was captured by cameras recording the practice. Her father carried her away as she cried out in pain, asking why something like this happened to her. While Kerrigan was in the hospital, the championships went ahead. Harding placed first, ahead of Michelle Kwan. Kerrigan wasn't able to compete. Thankfully, the attack hadn't broken any bones. She was able to walk but was in too much pain to compete in the championships. But the skaters all agreed she had earned her spot on the Olympic team and was to be sent instead of Kwan. An investigation was already underway into the attack. It wasn't long before suspicion fell on Harding. The FBI interviewed people from her entourage, and one of her bodyguards admitted the truth. Harding's ex-husband, Jeff Gillooly, had plotted the attack. The person who actually did the deed was hired hitman Shane Stant, but it was the people closest to Harding who were truly responsible. Harding denied any involvement in the attack and was shocked when the truth came out, but the FBI didn't believe the story. They told Kerrigan that even though they didn't have any proof, they believed she was the mastermind. Harding to this day has denied being the person responsible. Later in life, she claimed Gillooly was violent towards her, and she feared for her life when she was around him. But when legal proceedings began, Harding pleaded guilty to conspiring to hinder prosecution. She now claimed she'd learned afterwards that Gillooly was behind the attack, but hadn't come forward with information. Harding was handed a fine and sentenced to community service and 3 years probation. She was allowed to compete in the Olympics, but was then barred from taking part in any other competitions. Number 1. Olympic athletes represent their countries on the world stage. Ahead of the 2016 Games in Brazil, US athletes were warned to be on their best behavior and not to disrespect their host. This had been going well until swimmer Ryan Lochte reported a horrifying armed robbery. It was an armed robbery that didn't happen. Before the Rio Olympic Games, there had been a lot of media speculation surrounding the city's safety. Rio had a reputation as one of the most dangerous cities in the world. The government had been trying to combat that reputation, but stories of tourists being kidnapped and taken to ATMs were unfortunately still common. Security was increased during the Games, but that didn't stop some athletes from running into trouble. Nobody was seriously hurt, but it seemed like some athletes came close during the central weekend of the 2-week event. Ryan Lochte was one of the most successful swimmers in US history. He'd already won multiple Olympic medals before the Rio Games. On August 9th of 2016, he added one more medal to his total when he took gold for the 4x200-meter freestyle relay. A few days later, Lochte and the other US swimmers went out to celebrate their success at a party hosted by the French authorities. The group enjoyed themselves, staying out well into the early hours of the morning. It was past 5 a.m. when they finally piled into a taxi to return to the Olympic Village, a drive of between 30 minutes and an hour. When the group were captured on CCTV at the village, they seemed to still be in good spirits. Lochte was seen waving his credentials about and didn't appear to be in any trouble. But not long after, news broke that the group had been the victims of an armed robbery. The story first came from Lochte's mother, but he later confirmed it. According to Lochte, the taxi they were traveling in was stopped by men posing as police officers. They didn't have uniforms or lights, but were carrying a police badge. They ordered the swimmers to get on the floor. Lochte tried to resist. He told the fake officers they'd done nothing wrong and they wouldn't be getting on the floor. But that was when the robber turned his weapon on Lochte and he gave in. The robbers took their wallets and money but left behind their credentials and passports. Rio de Janeiro police immediately began investigating the crime, but the swimmers claimed they were unable to remember the color or make of the taxi or exactly where the crime had even taken place. They didn't have any details for the police to follow up on. The police also couldn't find the taxi driver who'd come under attack. And it didn't take long for the truth to come out. Lochte first changed his story, saying they'd stopped at a gas station to use the bathroom and they were attacked. But the police believed something else entirely had happened at the gas station. One of the other athletes confessed to the truth. The swimmers had been struck when they stopped at the gas station and caused damage to the property. They'd tried to leave, but the owner wanted the athletes to pay for damages. A security guard stopped the taxi and forced them out. The men paid $20 in US dollars and 100 Brazilian real. When the truth came out, the US Olympic Committee and USA Swimming suspended Lochte for 10 months for the lie. The other swimmers were suspended for 4 months. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.